Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a look at black independent cinema when I put Charles Burnett's Killer of Sheep against Charles Burnett's To Sleep with Anger. And this one was a hard one to get through because both of these movies are very powerful and very good in their own right. And of course, the same director. I very seldom do directors against directors because I don't really think that it proves anything on which was better because time periods go and stuff. But sometimes there's not enough stuff that's similar for both decades. So just let's dive right on in to the first one, written and directed by Charles Burnett, Killer of Sheep, which was it's shot in black and white, and it takes place in the neighborhood of Watts in South Central Los Angeles. And the film centers around a man named Stan, played by Henry Gale Sanders, who's absolutely brilliant in the film. Of course, the title of the film, Killer of Sheep, refers to his profession as a butcher in a slaughterhouse for sheep. And of course, very blue collar working family. They're struggling just to get by. He's got a wife and kids, and he's doing his best to resist temptation of all the bad influences that go on in the neighborhood. And he's got people trying to get him to go out on a hit with them, and not to kill somebody per se, but just to be in the background. And there's a lot of other stuff. Always somebody wanting money or some other kind of bullshit going on. And he does his best to hold his head up high and do right for his family and stuff. And the film itself is very episodic. What it is it kind of just shows it's like a slice of life drama type thing. Get very reminiscent of the stripped down type films of the French New Wave and Italian neorealism. And what it does is it was a time period where blaxploitation films were steadily getting phased out by the late 70s, were being replaced by more message pictures like Cornbread Earl and Me and and stuff like that. And you start to see this independent film voice that's in between the blaxploitation movement and in what Spike Lee would kind of explode with in the mid to late 80s. But Charles Burnett is definitely a singular voice in American cinema, and definitely showed Afro Americans in a very humanizing light. It doesn't really, the film itself is mostly just kind of, it feels like just real ass people. They're not really actors per se, but it's mostly to capture the atmosphere of this neighborhood and show these individuals as human beings as opposed to a fucking stereotype. And like I said, the film is very episodic. We see Stan try to get his stuff together. There's a very devastating scene where he goes to get this engine fix car and stuff, but it falls out of the back of the truck, and it's just damn. You think they could have tied it down or something, but just that devastation of that. And his wife is brilliant, lovely, and she does her best to keep a good head. Trying to find moments of tenderness and all the myriad of depression and stuff, but. Like I said, the film itself is very powerful. Charles Burnett is kind of like the Black John Cassavetes. He really knows how to capture real emotions on the screen and to show people that would not normally be shown in a film. You very rarely saw working class people in general, real working class people in the cinema, let alone black working class people. And then you move forward to the 90s with his film To Sleep with Anger, which is yet again written and directed by Charles Burnett. But this time he's got a better cast. He's got actual actors. Danny Glover is kind of the centerpiece of the film. His name is Harry, and he's kind of a mysterious figure. He comes into the family of Gideon, played by Paul Butler, who they're old friends from way back when. They haven't seen each other in 30 years, but he lets him into the house. Kind of not so much takes over, but he just kind of. He definitely has a strong influence. A lot of weird shit happens, and once this dude is there, Gideon gets sick, he's all laid up in bed, and a lot of other strange shit happens. Gideon's wife, he cuts her hand, and he kind of in a way seduces one of the sons, the young son they call baby brother in it, and his wife is played brilliantly by Cheryl Lee Ralph, the amazingly beautiful Cheryl Lee Ralph. And the movie has a bunch of other great actors, the lovely Vanetta McKee is in this, and Julius Harris has a small role in it. And and it's just a film that's shot brilliantly in color too. So it's like it's not even a thing against like what black and white film or color film. It does like feel more like a real movie. You know, it's not as episodic, but it does kind of have that episodic nature. But the whole story is this strange drifter from, you know, the past come, because this is a family that they moved from the country in the deep south to South Central Los Angeles, and they're trying to make a life for themselves there, and they have. And it also deals with a lot of the generational conflicts, you know, because you got the older generation kind of clashing with the newer generation, you know, because the older generation still tries to preserve that old way in the face of like all the new shit coming about. And, you know, of course, the younger generation is naturally going to resist all that shit. And that is done. The movie itself is very layered. And, you know, of course, Harry's presence is what kind of sets off all of the crazy shit that goes on. And, you know, at the end, when he trips on those fucking marbles that kid left on the floor and dies, then Gideon gets over his ailment and everything is kind of back to normal. Because we see, like, even when Vanetta McKee, who's pregnant in the film, like, the baby starts kicking whenever, like, really bad when she's next to Harry. And so you clearly can see, like, you know, this motherfucker's got a lot of, like, bad juju type thing. And he himself, like, you know, they are very superstitious. And, of course, the family is, too. He coming from the country and shit. They still kind of retain those superstitious values and stuff. And the music in it is fucking great, too. Like, there's a lot of great atmosphere. I feel like I wouldn't necessarily, like, both of these films were, like, indie films. You know, I feel like he may have had definitely a bigger budget on To Sleep with Anger. Now, I don't necessarily think that makes a better movie, because there's been a lot of movies that had like shoestring budgets that were far superior to most like big budget movies. But this was still like, even in the early 90s with like the explosion of filmmakers like Spike Lee and John Singleton, you know, there still wasn't that big of a voice for black independent cinema. And of course, Charles Burnett was one of the pioneers of that, especially in the late 70s and the early 80s. And you could tell this is kind of the film that he really wanted to make. You know, this might be his masterpiece, To Sleep with Anger. So this round clearly has to go to Sleep with Anger. And anybody keeping score, that's 59-49. 70s are only up by 10, but the 90s, like I said, they keep coming back with a 1-2 punch. It's like, you know, it's a weird kind of thing, especially when you compare a director's own work against, you know, when you put a director's work against their other work. And especially seeing that transition, because like like I said, it's a very hard decision, because Killer of Sheep is also very powerful as well. But the performances in To Sleep with Anger are better. He has more professional actors to work with, and of course, like, in my opinion, like a great director can get a performance out of anybody, and I feel like Charles Burnett did get a really good performance out of all of his actors for both movies. But this one also, To Sleep with Anger, has a better story, you know, and it has like, it's more of not so much atmosphere, but you feel like every fucking emotion in this film. Because there are times where it's like how some of those French New Wave and Italian neo-realist movies kind of have flaws. That's the same kind of flaws that Killer Sheep have. I don't know if I'd call To Sleep with Anger a perfect movie, but it is a really good fucking movie, and it's definitely unique, and definitely took a further way of showing Black Afro-Americans in a humanistic light, you know, instead of stereotypes. There's really no stereotypes in this film other than, like, you know, kind of maybe the country bumpkin, but that's the whole point of the story. Is that's also a culture clash too, you know, this family that moves from the deep south to South Central Los Angeles and dealing with that shit. And so 59-49 for anybody keeping score. 70s are up by 10 still, but the 90s keep coming back with those 1-2 punches. And of course, like Charles Burnett, like I said, the Black John Cassavetes, his films, there's really nothing like his films. And he was one of the great cinematic voices in independent cinema. So if you haven't like discovered the films of Charles Burnett, definitely give those a shot, especially these two films, as well as his other filmography. You won't be disappointed. And of course, you'll see more of these bonus rounds come in and out. You know, I have a main event every Saturday, so stay tuned for all of that. And if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. You know, it's just one asshole's opinion. I'm on this little self-indulgent journey to fucking find out, what decade was better for movies, the 70s or the 90s. And it's neck and neck, but the 70s still hold that lead. So who knows? We still got a lot of boogieing to do before we figure out the answer and before I can say I'm right or I'm wrong.